Hello, my name is Grant Joseph, and prior to beginning, I'd like to apologize. I'm going to be doing a 10-minute talk for myself and another 10-minute talk for my colleague, Colleen Seymour, who's currently in the field. By way of introduction, we are both savanna ecologists, and prior to our work in Madagascar, we're based in the Miombo woodland systems of Africa. Now, my main interest is in savanna ecology, but also in the impacts of historical change brought about by human presence in systems. And for this reason, Madagascar, and particularly the Malagasy Central Highlands, is close to my heart, not only because the system is obviously a multitude of complex ecosystems and not one system, but also because the Malagasy Central Highlands as a grassland does not fit at all well into the current mesec savanna model, and I'll be taking us through the shortfalls of this in this talk. An interesting starting point is that globally, savannas are constrained by mean annual precipitation, and a recent study has just shown that the Malagasy Central Highlands are constrained at very high rainfall levels of up to 3,000 millimeters. Now, the pertinent thing here is that this is almost double the rainfall level where one would expect savanna to transition to forest in mainland Africa. And essentially, it makes the Malagasy Central Highlands the wettest savanna on Earth. Given this surprising finding, I constructed a 325-site pan-Malagasy Central Highland dataset and compared the vegetation at each site with rainfall bins across the Malagasy Central Highlands. When plotted, my findings showed that there is no limit to savanna by mean annual precipitation on the Malagasy Central Highlands. Indeed, at rainfall levels of 3,000 millimeters, there is almost a 90% likelihood of savanna on the Malagasy Central Highlands, as you can see from the upper blue line in the graph. This is in contrast to all other savanna systems, mesec savanna systems globally, which would generally have a 90% chance of forest at mean annual precipitation of this level. And this poses a very important question. Why is there decoupling of mean annual precipitation in Madagascar from habitat? A parsimonious explanation has been provided by recent work by Thompson and others, who looked at a 600,000-year core in an African system. This was a multidisciplinary study, and what was found is that climate, pre-humans, would vacillate, and wet periods would lead to forested closed canopy systems. Dry periods would favor a grassy open biome. However, at permanent human settlement, human-lit fires led to a tipping point being reached. After this point had been reached, a new habitat emerged, which was fire-tolerant and grassy, and no matter how high rainfall was after this event, there was never a return to forest, and instead alluvial fans developed, signifying erosion. The Malagasy Central Highlands have a similarly impressive pollen core dating back 154,000 years. What is intriguing with this core is that it also vacillates with climate, with wetter periods being more forested and dry periods being more grassy. Indeed, there were grassy periods 125,000 years ago, 65,000 years ago, 17,000 years ago, and 4,000 years ago. But all these periods were associated with high levels of either ericoid pollens or tree pollens. This all changed with human settlement. At that point, there was a crash in both forest and woodland pollen and ericoid pollen, which at the time represented 80% of pollens. Grasses only represented 15% at that time. Following settlement, grass pollens approached 80%, and other pollens dwindled to insignificance. There has never been a time in the pollen record where grass pollens approach 100% as they do today. So there's a clear shift And one needs to ask, what caused such a change? There is every suggestion that humans changed the balance and that a tipping point was reached on the Malagasy Central Highlands at human settlement. There's clear evidence for decoupling of habitat from mean annual precipitation through human-led fires 1,000 years ago, and this is corroborated by island-wide speleotherm findings. The habitat that emerges does not resemble anything that precedes it. It is grassy, it is less biodiverse, and it explains very nicely the persistence of grassland where forest is anticipated. Indeed, a 90% savanna probability at 3,000 millimeters is nicely corroborated by this diagram. So humans arrive at low density. Density increases, hunting techniques intensify, fire use increases, and ultimately the landscape emerges with a reduced biodiversity, and hunting and foraging are replaced by pastoralism. Using an exploratory data set based on NASA data, I also found a similar decoupling for fire. Savanna systems globally are limited in fire frequency by mean annual precipitation, and by 2,500 millimeters you would not expect to find high fire frequency. Yet in Madagascar there's this absolute decoupling, and the likelihood of fire at rainfall approaching 3,000 millimeters is still 90%. Given that today 80% of Malagasy Central Highlands are grassland, it is hard to consider that they could be anthropogenic until one considers how very quickly forest can be converted to C4 grassland. In Madagascar, in the lowland forests, this process only takes 30 years. It involves 7 well-documented, well-named fallow cycles, and ultimately, after this time frame of cutting and burning, we see dominance of a few widespread grass species and prominent erosion gullies. Interestingly, these species are not that dissimilar from those on the Malagasy Central Highlands. And what is important to note is that the study was conducted in an area that had only been settled for 150 years, whereas the Malagasy Central Highlands has been subject to 2,000 years of human settlement. Natural savanna systems vacillate between more woody habitat in times that are wet and a more grassy habitat when it is drier. These habitats would share a C4 grass assemblage, and it's for this reason that certain authors propose that tapis represents the natural woody component of the treeless grassland. My findings cannot corroborate this, and I find significant difference in grass assemblages between tapis woodland and the grasses in the treeless savanna. Indeed, the grasses in tapis woodland are best explained by grasses with forest trays, and this suggests that the tapis system is actually a unique habitat and does not corroborate it as being part of a larger savanna system. Another important anomaly involves feeding. It is well known that grasslands have co-evolved with obligate grazers, and this argument was used in a recent paper which stated that the grasslands in Madagascar had evolved in the context of obligate grazers. Yet, a careful evaluation of all subfossils unearthed in the Malagasy Central Highlands shows that not one was an obligate grazer. What I have done here is I have plotted African obligate grazers against the Malagasy subfossils. It is very clear that there is no evidence for C4 obligate grazers in Madagascar. But what is more pertinent is that these subfossils are from the Holocene, and they were eating C3 woody material throughout that period. And even at elevations where one would expect open habitat, C3 material was being eaten. Another major concern is fire. We know that in savanna systems, this facilitates C4 grass and reduces tree cover. Now, Madagascar is one of the most burned places on Earth, with a biannual to even annual fire regime, and that almost all fires are human-lit. The practice dates to early settlement, and counterintuitively, areas that are least densely settled experience the greatest human-lit fires. Fires are used to eradicate rice-eating birds, to increase erosion into rice paddies and to repair pasture and stimulate silkworm production in Tipi woodland. Yet fire remains the principal threat to Malagasy woodland, forest, ericoids, and endemic grasses, which themselves have been shown to be fire sensitive. Given that so many aspects of the Malagasy grasslands do not fit the music savanna model, we need to pose a serious question, which is, what would a new anthropogenic grassland look like? We know in Africa that ericoids cannot tolerate fires of 4 years, and that woodlands cannot tolerate annual fire frequencies, and both convert to grassland when this happens. The most cited paper on Malagasy grasslands notes that if grasslands originated what expanded from small areas in the last 2,000 years, we would expect dominance by few widespread species. On the subject of dominance, grasses become dominant if they're able to spread widely, have good properties of persistence, and adapt quickly to prevailing disturbances. Now, this allows species that were previously insignificant to become dominant species, and for Madagascar we already know the dominant species. They have been well collated in recent studies. They're all fire and grazing adapted, and molecular studies corroborate the thoughts of Bond and others, showing that populations of the most dominant species, Laudetia simplex, have expanded throughout northern Madagascar at the same time as fire-driven agriculture. Essentially, this shows that they persevered and dominated over very short times by adapting to the prevailing disturbance. And what is the proposed woody component to the Malagasy Central Highland savanna? Well, Tapi woodland, which is characterized by the species Wapaka pogeri, is much diminished across the Central Highlands, representing less than 5% of habitat. We do know that similar systems, including the Miombo system and Proteocaphorus woodlands in Africa, cannot sustain the fire frequencies that Tapi is subjected to. Indeed, what we know is that with burning of Miombo systems, Wapaka species are selected and other canopy species are lost, which should tell us a little story, because looking more closely at Wapaka, we find it to be present in many forested systems, including in Madagascar. And in Africa, Wapaka kirkiana, which is also thick barked and fire resistant, is associated with African lowland forests. Another pertinent point of interest is that the Central Highlands are filled with historic paleopollens of multiple tree families, and it may be useful to look to the Tapi-like western slopes sclerophyllous forests in Madagascar, which today contain up to 18 families of trees. The suggestion then is of greater historic complexity to the Central Highland Tapi stands, and Carl appears to be close to the mark when he states that Tapi woodland are an anthropogenic formation and that these have been modified by fire and human cutting. An important point to note is that endemicity is no proxy for natural grasslands, and indeed areas with high levels of grass endemicity happen to be forested islands, and Madagascar, as you can see from the graph here, plots most closely with historically forested islands such as New Zealand, Japan, Papua New Guinea, and the other Mascarenes. The other important factor is that this change can be very, very quick. New Zealand is a great example in that it was only settled 8 centuries ago, and yet today, following anthropogenic burning, it is dominated by a previously insignificant fire-resistant grass genus. Soils too are important with the consideration of savanna spread, and it is worth noting that broadly speaking, there is a shared geology and shared soils between the lowland forest areas and the Malagasy Central Highlands. Malagasy cultural knowledge also suggests a far more historically wooded Malagasy Central Highlands. When plotting toponyms named after forest, they cover much of the Malagasy Central Highlands, and plotted with recently lost forests and relic woodlands gives a picture of a trans-Malagasy Central Highland wooded system. It is also important to note that when plotting extirpated and extinct species, their sites, which date to literally 1,000 to 2,000 years ago, span much of the Malagasy Central Highlands, and indeed, current extant mammal species have ranges that cross the Malagasy Central Highlands from the eastern lowlands to the western aspects of Madagascar, showing that they were clear forested areas historically. Adaptive radiation requires persistent habitat over time. Malagasy fauna is 90% forest adapted. Less than 2% of the fauna is adapted to grasslands, yet the grassland comprises 80% of habitat. This is a biological global anomaly that cannot be overlooked. Some context is needed in this regard, and a previous study from 2008 looked at species restricted to grasslands, and unfortunately that study overreported the grassland limitation of faunal elements 17-fold. That same study also reported a pure C4 diet for some specimens of hippos. We now know that the hippo in question was an African hippo dating from between 1600 and 1950. The repercussions have appeared in the literature, and prominent journals have reported that obligate grazing flora co-evolved with these species, citing the same paper, even though there have been no obligate grazing hippos. And similarly, there's been an argument that mesic savannas do not have a recent anthropogenic origin precisely because of the accumulation of diverse biota cited from the paper in question. This absence of obligate grazers is really marked when one compares Madagascar to other East Gondwana savanna systems, which all have roughly 60% composition of their herbivore suite being obligate grazers. Madagascar, it is 0%. And what is more peculiar is that the system contained hippopotami, and hippopotami have to be considered as ideal obligate grazing candidates. Indeed, they are the most important, amongst the most important obligate grazers in African systems, and yet in Madagascar they failed to evolve into obligate grazers. Also pertinent is that the closest relatives of euperids, tenreks, and nesomiid rodents in Africa are all strongly savanna adapted in their radiations, yet in Madagascar not a single group became predominantly grassland adapted. This anomaly should raise a massive red flag. In summary then, we have actually constructed a map, and we have submitted it. The submission took place a couple of months before this meeting was proposed. What we focused on was the rainfall gradient, mean annual precipitation, the relic habitats of forest, recently lost forests, the toponyms that were mentioned, the complexity of microhabitats, the soils, geology, topography. We looked at paleopollens that were rich, tree-rich on the Madagascar Central Highlands, as well as the forest-limited subfossils in Holocene times, that these subfossils during the Holocene ate woody material, not grassy material. That C4 grasses are ancient dated to the Miocene. We looked into the faunal radiation that hasn't occurred in grasslands, the absence of obligate grazing evolution, the ranges of extant mammals across the Madagascar Central Highland that are forest limited. We also interrogated the point that there's never been a period with grass monodominance on the Madagascar Central Highlands. And we put this into the context of an island-wide shift shown by speleotherm data. But most importantly, we looked at novel disturbance regimes. There were no cattle before humans arrived. We looked at how molecular studies corroborate the spread of dominant grasses with this new disturbance of fire and grazing, and the role of biannual fires and grazing in maintaining a grassland. This is our rough postulate that was sent in, showing where we would expect more evergreen woody habitat, and woody habitat with the grassy understory and grasslands, and ericoid thickets with grasslands at altitude, with multiple microhabitats throughout, including peat bogs, marshes, and rocky habitats. Our take-home message then is that open habitats are not necessarily savanna grasslands, and I would like us to open our minds to the possibility of a more ericoid past, where we consider fire-adapted shrublands interspersed with orchids and other bulbous species, which to quite a degree are corroborated with current findings on the grasslands of such species. So let's reconsider the possibility of a well-wooded, ericoid-rich late Holocene Malagasy Central Highland at human settlement, which has been changed, possibly irrevocably, by our fire regimes and our introduction of ungulate grazers. I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to working with all of you in the future, and I am grateful for this opportunity to be here. Take care and all the best.